This video is to show you how to make your model bridge. The first thing you're going to need to do is to get your materials together. Then you're going to need to take your piece of foam board and you're going to need to wrap some wax paper on that foam board. Now what I did here is I took a piece of wax paper that's a little longer than the foam board is, so it would hang off the edges, and I wrapped it around the back and I taped it onto the back, and I pulled that wax paper really tight across the front so that when I tape it here on the back, this wax paper sits flat on the foam board. Once I have the foam board wrapped in wax paper to keep the glue from sticking to it, I'm going to take my pattern here and I'm going to slide it in between the wax paper and the foam board like so. So then my pattern is protected from the glue when I glue up my bridge. I'm going to start by taking my pieces and I'm going to start cutting the outline, the outer pieces of my side panel, this one here. We're going to make two of these, so I need to do this one first. So I'm going to take that piece of wood, I'm going to lay it right across my pattern, and I'm going to use my knife to do what's called a score cut. And a score cut doesn't cut all the way through, it's just a little mark here on the piece of wood, just to mark where I want to cut it. And I'm going to cut all the way through on my cutting board. I don't want to cut here on the foam board because I'll cut into the foam board, I'll cut through the wax paper and through my pattern. So I'm going to take my cutting board and right where I made my little score cut, there's a little mark. I'm going to cut all the way through. When you cut with the X-Acto knife, you want to kind of rock it back and forth. You don't want to slice going this way. So you want to rock like this as you push down, not back and forth like this. So we'll cut one piece at a time and lay that down on the foam board. And you're going to need to use your pins now to pin that piece in place. And you want to hold that piece right where your pattern is, and you're going to put your pins on the outside of the piece that you cut. You're not going to put the pin through the center of the piece. You don't want to jam the pin through the piece of wood because it could break it. And I'm going to stagger the pins on either side to keep this piece of wood from moving around. So you want the pins to go right up next to the piece of wood. Once you have several pins put in to hold it in place, you'll want to make sure that the pins aren't where other pieces will get placed. So I put a pin here, pin here, pin here, pin here, in between pieces that'll be going up and down. So I'll go on with my top piece here, and I'll make a score cut right here, and I'll cut it the rest of the way on my cutting board. And I'll do the same thing. I'll pin it in place so that it doesn't move around on us. Now, use enough pins that the pieces don't move, but don't overdo it because you got to pull these out eventually. So you just want enough so it doesn't wiggle around. Now we're going to start doing our shorter pieces that go on the inside here. So when I cut these pieces, I'm going to want to lay them on top of the two long pieces I just cut. Okay, and I'm going to take my X-Acto knife and I'm going to place the X-Acto knife where they overlap. Where I see the two pieces come together is right where I want to make a little score mark, and the same thing down here. So I can cut those two pieces so they have an angle on them, and they'll fit right in between the two long pieces I just cut. So now when I place these in here, okay, they're angled, but this has a gap. If you cut your pieces and you see a gap like I have here, that's no good. So I'm going to need to cut a new piece because I want the pieces to fit together. I don't want there to be a gap between pieces. So if you're not sure, it's usually better to cut the pieces long because you can always trim them if need be. See, this works much better because now there's no gap between any of the pieces. So once I get the piece cut, I can go ahead and pin it in place. And these pieces may move around a little bit, and you just may need to use more pins to hold things in place. So use more pins if you need to. And once we get this pinned, we'll do the same thing with the other side. We'll cut another piece. And I like to always check and see if something I already cut, like this one here, fits. So I already had a piece already cut for us. So I'll pin this guy in, and if your pieces aren't exactly on your lines you drew for your pattern, that's okay. We'll just have to work around that, but to make it perfect is really, really difficult. So we're going to try to just make it as close as possible and go from there. I need one more on this side. Okay. So now once I get the outline made like this, then I can start cutting the pieces on the inside, the rest of these, and I'll start with the ones going up and down, and then the diagonal pieces come last. So I do the same thing that I just did for these two diagonal pieces I made. I bump this piece up against this one, and then I do a score cut down here, and then I could cut on my cutting board. And if I need to trim the piece, I could trim it if it's a little too long, and that fits just fine. So the important thing here is to make sure that there's no gaps between the pieces, because the glue doesn't hold very well. It actually is very brittle when it dries, which means it can break easily. So it's not going to hold the weight. It's just going to hold the pieces of wood together. That's all the glue is meant to do. So we don't want to continue to cut. We'll cut all these vertical pieces, and then we'll do the diagonal pieces next. To have to fill in. Once we have cut out all of our pieces, we will need to glue them together. Now, ideally, when you make your bridge, what you'll want to do is you want to cut out all the pieces for your side panel, this one here. You'll want to pin them all together and then make sure everything fits together, then start to glue them together. So this one, I already cut out the bottom panel, but we'd want to actually go ahead and glue this one up and then cut this one out before we glue. So make sure that all the pieces fit together, and you're going to take your glue bottle and you're going to open that up, and you're going to put some glue here in one of the corners so that you can use that glue. And you don't need much, just a little pool of it like that will be good. And we're going to take your pieces of wood and we're going to glue those small pieces together. So you don't have to take out the two long pieces, you're just going to take out the short pieces here. So one by one we're going to take the short pieces out, and you may need to use a scrap piece of wood or your knife to help pick the pieces up. And you can glue the pieces together one of two ways. We could take the pieces and we can dip them directly into the pool of glue here, and we can put them back in place. And I'll use my knife to help push that in. Or you can take a piece of scrap wood and you can dip that into the glue, and you can lift up the pieces just a little bit just to get some glue on the ends. And make sure you're very careful you don't move the pieces around too much and you don't use too much glue. So we're just trying to use this little stick here to apply the glue onto the ends without having to actually pick them up. And usually that's a little easier because you don't have to pull the pieces completely out. So we would want to continue going along all the pieces and gluing the small pieces, the ends of the small pieces, and the two long pieces here going horizontally do not need to get removed. So once I glue those, I'll leave this to dry, and then the next day I'll actually pull out all the pins, and I'll use my X-Acto knife to pry the pieces up off of the wax paper. So when you take that wax paper off away from the piece of wood, it may tear, but that's okay. It's better that the wax paper tears than for your pieces to break. So you'll need to let that dry before you remove your panel and your pins. So glue the pieces, let the pins stay until this is all dry, and then remove the pins the next day and remove the piece by using your knife to kind of pry it up off the wax paper. And then you can move on to working on one of these other panels. And remember, you're going to need to do 2 of these side panels.